U.S. President Donald Trump continues to push his threat of Canada becoming the 51st state. And it's not the first time America has set its sights on this country. I'm here at the old burying ground in Halifax with local writer Craig Ferguson. So, Craig, on Sunday, former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien joked that, he's too old to burn down the White House. But we're standing in front of the grave of someone who actually did. Tell me a bit about that.
This is a grave of Major General Robert Ross, and he's sort of the most famous permanent resident here at the old burying ground. And what Major General Robert Ross is best known for is he was the first person to storm the Capitol and ultimately led the troops that burned the White House in Washington, D.C., August 24th, 1814.
And what led up to this? Of course, they were in the middle of the War of 1812.
They're in the middle of the War of 1812, and it was part of a series of raids that the British conducted along the American eastern seaboard, and it was in retaliation to the looting and burning of York, which is now Toronto.
Mm-hmm. And what was a bit of background on this fellow?
Well, Major General Robert Ross, he was born in Ireland, and he had been a decorated British military officer. He had led campaigns in Egypt. He'd been involved in the Napoleonic War. So, he was the kind of guy that they were going to turn to when they were undertaking this major campaign up along the U.S. eastern seaboard.
And just talk a bit about how it all unfolded.
Well, first, that same day, there was a battle at Bladensburg, which is near D.C., and Madison was leading his troops himself, and he had to retreat from Ross's troops. Ross's troops defeated them, they routed them, and so that defeat was what allowed them to enter the U.S. Capitol. And, they wrote about this. And at first, the British troops, they were kind of impressed by the Italianate architecture of the Capitol. They were reluctant to burn it, but they went ahead and did it anyways. And they burned the Capitol, and they raised the British flag up above the Capitol, and then they turned their sights on the presidential mansion, which is, of course, the White House. Dolly Madison was setting out the president's supper at the time, and she had to flee. She famously cut the portrait of George Washington out of its frame as she left, and she left all the service out. The British took the White House. They were able to eat the president's supper off his plates and silver, and then Ross himself helped stack the furniture as kindling in the White House and burned it.
How did he end up here?
It's a funny story. Just some weeks later, he was shot off his horse outside of Baltimore. He was heading to the Battle of Baltimore, and two American snipers, shot him off his horse. He was pickled in 121 gallons of Jamaican rum and shipped to the closest British port, which was Halifax, Nova Scotia. And it was a big to-do. Lady Sherbrooke, who was the wife of the lieutenant governor at the time, wrote all about it. There was a big procession from King's Wharf up to the old burying ground. The guns at Citadel Hill were firing. The guns on the ship were firing. And when they brought him here to the old burying ground, they fired 3 volleys over the grave itself. It was the highest military honors for a burial probably that the city had ever seen.
Was there an initial effort to get him back overseas, or how did he end up staying here for his final resting place?
That's a good question. I think the embalming technology being what it was at the time is just, a barrel of rum. I think that this was probably the best that they could hope for. Embalming, the way that we think of it today, has its roots in the American Civil War, which is some decades later, like 1865. So embalming technology, not what it was today. In fact, there's Admiral Nelson was treated the same way when he died. They pickled him in rum, and there's a rum punch called Nelson's Punch. I don't know if there's a version for Ross.
All right. You get a lot of American tourists coming through this graveyard. What are they looking for, and what's their reaction?
We do. We get hundreds of Americans coming every day, sometimes in the summer, especially with the cruise ship traffic. Of course, it's very important to the economy in Halifax. And it's a great thing to get them into the gates to say, hey, could I show you the grave of the guy who burned down the White House? And they're always curious about it. And nobody thinks of him as an enemy. I've never seen an American visitor spit on Major General Robert Ross's grave. But, it's such a curiosity because for so long we've gotten along so well that it's hard to imagine a time when we were at odds like this.
And there is this thought that it was Canadians that burned down the White House, and it's not true.
It's not true. I mean, Canada wasn't a country in 1814. Major General Robert Ross had never been in what's now Canada or Halifax when he was alive at all. He was Irish born and a British military figure. So, maybe a handful of his troops were Canadian, but even that seems pretty unlikely.
What did you think of former Prime Minister Chrétien's remarks?
And I don't know, apparently some burned the White House at that time. But I'm too old to do it. No, it's a joke.
I laughed and paused the TV and scrolled back and wrote down what he said right after he said it. But we've heard it before, right? In the past, during the first Trump presidency, Donald Trump said, "Hey, didn't you guys burn down the White House?" And that was when he was negotiating aluminum and steel tariffs with Justin Trudeau, and trying to press tariffs somehow as a national security issue. I think he was joking. Everybody thought it was a joke at the time anyways, but when he said you guys, he meant Canadians, but Canada wasn't a country. There was no such thing as Canadians, and really who he meant was Major General Robert Ross, and his only claim to being Canadian is that he's buried here in downtown Halifax in the old burying ground.
Well, it is a fascinating walk through history, and thank you for taking us through it.
Thank you.